Since Hurricane Harvey, the greater Houston area has grown by about 1.3 million people. The vast majority of this growth has been in Houston's suburbs and exurbs, places like the Woodlands, Katy, Sugarland, Pearland. And as the area has welcomed these new residents, developers and government leaders across the region have encouraged construction, especially important given the rising costs of affordable housing and the nationwide housing crisis that we're living through. However, the where and how of this housing is raising questions. In a recent series of investigative pieces, the Houston Chronicle has detailed how keeping up with our area's rising population has meant that a large number of homes have been built not only in flood-prone areas, but in explicitly federally designated floodplains, putting new homeowners, neighbors, and citizens downstream at risk. So today, we're sitting down with the Houston Chronicle reporter behind this discovery to talk about how and where we've been building new homes and what that means for flood risk all over the Houston region. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and Associate Director of Eco Studio and Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Yilun Cheng is an investigative reporter at the Houston Chronicle who's been digging into where new homes all over the Houston region are being built, and she's found that many are at high risk of flooding. Yilun Cheng, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So I invited you on to talk about kind of a series of stories really you've been doing for the Chronicle, thinking deeply about construction post-Harvey, but particularly in floodplains. I mean, the real meat of the story here is that it turns out we've been extensively building in floodplains around kind of greater Harris County, greater Houston area. So can you just walk us through a little bit, maybe first, how this even came to your attention, and then what you've been discovering and finding in your reporting?
Sure. So when we first started this project, the big question on our minds was, what did Houston actually learn from Hurricane Harvey, right? Because many people saw the storm as a warning against, the danger of building in floodplains. Mm-hmm. But ever since then, the region continues to grow. And it seems like development hasn't really slowed in floodplains. And we keep hearing stories from people who bought into brand new neighborhoods only to find out later that their property is vulnerable to flooding. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to find out if that's just a few unlucky families, or are we talking about a larger pattern here? So we dug into the data and went through hundreds of thousands of property records across the 5 biggest counties in the greater Houston region. And the numbers were quite shocking. But basically, the main takeaway is Harvey hasn't really slowed down development in floodplains at all. And we seem to be repeating the same development patterns that made Harvey so devastating in the first place.
So I think for folks who are listening, this is probably really surprising because there was a kind of culture shift after Harvey, even in thinking about the Kinder Institute and their kind of annual report for the first time was really showing numbers. And I'm going to be in the ballpark, but not exact here. But, it was around 80% of Houstonians post-Harvey suddenly switched to, we don't want to see construction and sales in repeat flood areas, that we know if a home is flooded multiple times, we actually don't want that to continually come to market, that this is an issue. And that was a big shift, and those numbers have dropped off every year. We can watch how that's changed somewhat. And Harvey, I mean, it's one of those funny things. Harvey's not very long ago, and yet in some ways it does feel very much in a kind of cultural rearview mirror. And so I think I think when I saw this story, I was surprised, maybe a little shocked, but also somehow not. Somehow, right. It's I want to believe the lessons of Harvey have stuck, and then there's really hard data that maybe they haven't as much.
Exactly. And what stood out to me was it's happening everywhere, right? We're not just talking about a few pockets of land. It's happening north of Houston, around Spring, in North Harris County around Conroe, in Montgomery County. It's happening out west in Katy and Fort Bend County, down south in Galveston County. So basically everywhere in the region where we've seen a lot of growth in the past decade.
And I want to just, not to go too deep in the numbers, but I mean, in your reporting, I have it right that it's about 1 in 5 homes, right? It's about 20% that you're finding are built in floodplains.
Right.
And that, I mean, I think that was about 65,000
across the 5 counties,
which is just a tremendous number. I mean, the idea that 65,000 families presumably are moving into areas that we can map out and know are higher risk of flooding in an area that is flood prone is disturbing. And I think especially because the interesting thing you had mentioned the post Harvey of it, and I think that is this marker. But also Harvey is an interesting outlier. Harvey is like a year's worth of water falling on the city in a few days. And so, I know when I was searching for a home last year, finding one that didn't flood in Harvey was a real thing and was a real marker and was like a selling point that you would see, did not flood in Harvey. And that's still very much a kind of the vernacular of how we talk about flood risk. And I think what's interesting and what some of your reporting also points to is, well, as we develop new areas, as we move into other areas, that lifts the risk on everywhere else. And that increases these risks and puts homes in places that are even potentially more at risk. So if the barometer is, well, it didn't flood in Harvey, you might not need a Harvey scale incident to see flooding in many of these places and to contribute to more flooding elsewhere. Is that right?
Exactly. And you probably know the science much better than I do. But how it works is, when natural land is replaced by concrete and rooftops, the water that once soaked into the soil has to go somewhere else, right? So that can push flooding into nearby neighborhoods. So by building in floodplains, we're not just putting the families who end up living in those houses at risk, it's going to affect entire neighborhoods.
Absolutely. I mean, that's that kind of downstream effect, which we've certainly talked about on the program before. But exactly as you're pointing, things like our coastal prairie are much better reservoirs for that excess water. And as you said, when we just put concrete down, that doesn't do any of that kind of storage work. So it just enhances the risk for everybody else in the region.
Right. An expert told us, every time we put a Walmart parking lot or a rooftop over natural land, that's changing the floodplain dynamic. So it's not just that we're moving into the floodplains, it's also that the floodplains are moving into us.
Oh, that's a really good way of putting that. Something that I also thought was really interesting in this, and that I think Houstonians in particular probably may be aware of, I think if folks have been kind of following anything around floodplains and flooding in the last few years, is there's been this expectation that there were going to be new floodplain maps. And those still haven't been released, right?
Right. We've been waiting for a while now.
And so FEMA's been supposed to put these out. And so I think there's also this kind of odd moment of, even within the old floodplains, which we think are going to be less extensive amounts of land than whatever these new floodplain maps are looking like, we're seeing this construction. And so I'm already kind of wondering, all right, if we do get new maps released by FEMA, if we do see a greater area being listed in that floodplain, if 1 in 5 are already in known areas, what does that mean for this new kind of expanded map going to be? And of course, there's no really way to know exactly, but I am curious if in your reporting you've been thinking about those upcoming floodplains, or have any information just about, why they've been delayed or when maybe we can expect them.
So local flood officials in Harris County and FEMA are supposed to be working together to put out the new flood maps. But we've been waiting for years and years, and they keep getting delayed. And I don't want to speculate because I didn't hear it from Harris County or FEMA themselves. But some people are saying, it's very political. Like flood maps are not just about the science, it's about the politics and the people, the real estate interests they're going to affect too. Based on rainfall data, we don't know the specifics, right, the exact numbers, but based on rainfall data, local flood officials in Harris County are supposed to be working with FEMA to put out a new flood maps, but it's taking years and years, and it keeps getting delayed. And I don't want to speculate because I didn't hear it from Harris County or FEMA themselves, but a lot of people think it's a political problem too. It's not just about the science, but it's also the powerful real estate interests who will be affected by the new floodplains. And based on the rainfall data, we're going to see the 100-year floodplain expand significantly to cover basically what a 500-year floodplain covers right now.
So, I mean, yeah, so that inversion that, the risk is hypothetically 1% in a given year, 500, you kind of to your time span, much larger area. And so that does tell us a lot. And also tells us that 100-year floodplain, that 500-year floodplain is going to move as well. And so
Exactly.
a lot of these areas, which I'll just shout out the Chronicle, has a really interesting kind of map your house tool that you can go into, put in your address and see kind of current floodplain risk, but also a kind of projection of what the expectation is going forward. That's a useful tool for folks who are thinking about where they're moving or where they're looking at. You mentioned the politics of this, and I think a lot of your follow-up reporting has focused on developers in particular, both thinking about the fact that it seems like it's a handful maybe of developers who've really done the majority of this building. But can you talk a little more about that politics, about that tension between perhaps protecting those areas, which I think is a natural inclination. Like we do tend to, especially in a place like Houston, drive around and see undeveloped land and think, why is it sitting there? Why aren't we doing it? It's just grass, right? We should, not realizing maybe that grass is actually doing really important infrastructural work for protecting us. But I think that is a kind of inclination that folks tend to have. So can you talk to us a little bit about the developer side of this and that piece, that how it's even possible that if we know these are areas that are at risk, we are able to build houses there?
So there usually are some restrictions on where you can build and the kind of mitigation measures you would have to implement to make sure whatever you build doesn't worsen downstream neighborhoods. But like we discussed, the rules are based on outdated data. So some people are saying the rules should be stricter. Another problem is in Texas, like many other states, we don't have a statewide flood building code. So it's really up to individual cities and counties to decide on their own regulations. And some are strict, but others are not. So we're having this patchwork of regulations that's leaving large parts of the region exposed. So the home builders, they can say, we're not breaking the law. We're just doing what we should be doing and then mitigating the impact of flooding. But what you're seeing is a handful of home builders, and including some of the biggest names in the home building industry, are responsible for hundreds and even over 1,000 homes in floodplains since Harvey. You're seeing people like Leonard Homes, Perry Homes, D.R. Horton, Meritage Homes, and some of these large home building power brokers locally. And on top of that, a lot of these home builders and developers have significant political influence locally. Some of them are big donors. So some people are telling me we really have an industry that's built or designed to facilitate risky development instead of pumping the brakes when the risk is too high.
Which is interesting because you alluded to this a little bit earlier when you made the comment about part of the impact of Harvey was the way we built the city. And I think what you're getting at there is Houston is a sprawling place, and the fastest growing parts of it, in fact, are those exurban communities. And so I think what you're alluding to there is just that geographic spread, that kind of way that we are building in hard infrastructure so many places really makes it hard for water to have a place to sit and to go to. And as we continue that development pattern, we're just worsening some of that. Can you talk a little bit about what you meant by that? And if I'm in the ballpark of suggesting that, these developments do contribute to the way that we're thinking through what the city could be, because I understand there's a real desire from developers of single family homes. We know we can sell them. We know that's but what else are the options there? Because we want Houston to grow. I think most people in Houston would say they want more housing. They want housing to stay affordable. So are there other ways we could imagine this development pattern that wouldn't exacerbate those risks?
Sure. So like you mentioned, a big problem is land and land availability. In the Houston region, we're simply running out of, easy dry land to build on. And so developers are being pushed to build further and further out. And a lot of that land just happens to be flood prone. So as we think about the future and how to build more in a smarter and more responsible way. Some cities are already considering other housing types besides single-family homes, right? But then also, in the Houston region and in Texas, a lot of people feel very emotionally attached to that suburban lifestyle.
Yeah.
And the region is growing partly because people from out of state are moving here in search of that Houston suburban lifestyle. A lot of space, kind of peaceful neighborhood, a sense of community. And some of them are also waterfront properties. And for them, they were not here during Harvey. They haven't personally experienced the kind of flooding that Houstonians personally face all the time. So they see a pretty water view and they can see it as a plus. So for developers, some of them they're buying floodplain land at a discount and then selling the homes at a premium.
I mean, that's really tricky. And I think what you're getting at is really core there, because I think it's something that Houstonians have long prided themselves on, is like Houston is a place people can afford to move. It's still a place that, yes, housing has gotten much more expensive in the last few years. Yes, we have seen, like everywhere, that, inflation has had real impacts on people's life and quality of life. But I think, for many Houstonians, it still remains this idea of like, this is a place you can have the American dream, that you can come here, you can have a house, you can, raise a family, and it's not California, it's not New York, you're not in this kind of price range. And so I think there is this kind of natural hesitancy, to put it charitably, around the idea of any kind of restrictions to that. And as you're pointing to, any kind of change to what that imaginary suburban life looks like.
Exactly.
So,
Texas has a very strong private property ethos, too.
Yeah.
So people don't like the idea of the government telling them what they can or cannot do to their own property. And that's a real challenge.
Well, and I think in some of your writing, you allude to this as well, because as you mentioned, Texas doesn't have a kind of statewide designation of flooding, kind of regulation, right? And I think you wrote in one piece that actually after Harvey, Governor Abbott tried to advance a kind of flood infrastructure regulation package mirrored or based a little bit on Florida's kind of wind resistance regulations, and tried to formalize that, and it didn't go anywhere. Can you talk a little bit about why we don't have more of a kind of statewide approach, maybe?
Sure. So that was actually one of the researchers I talked to, and he was involved in the post-Harvey effort, advising some of the state lawmakers. And then he had this idea that we should have a statewide flood building code similar to, like you said, what Florida did after their, big disaster. But actually, the governor and state lawmakers thought that was a crazy idea.
Oh,
we're just
okay.
So there just wasn't enough political buy-in because, the governor and the lawmakers do not want to touch the interests of big political donors who they rely on for support.
I think, yeah. I mean, I think I completely hear you, and I completely agree. There's obviously, as with anything in life, a lot of politics attached to regulation and decision-making. And I think there is a legitimate cultural battlefront here. And I don't mean that in a kind of like vague, this isn't a real I mean that I think there's something deeply embedded in kind of the imaginary of Texas that you were alluding to with the kind of private rights, the kind of, there is a very strong rugged individualism culture to America, but especially in Texas, that the idea that government's, not going to let us build or build fast or do the things the way that we want in a place that has been known for really, I mean, you look at Houston, it's not that old a place, and the defining characteristic of it has been almost every 10 years in the 20th century, certainly every 20 years, the population like doubles. I mean, that requires building and building out in a way that many across the political spectrum, I'll note right now, are actually calling for and saying we should be able to build much faster and we need to be building quickly because housing is a crisis in many places. And so I think this is, a kind of fraught topic and a difficult topic, but also I think therefore requires us to imagine and ask some real questions about, okay, if we want to maintain this quality of life, if we want housing to remain cheap, and we also don't want to put everybody at risk of flooding, what does that mean that we need to be doing for Houston? What are other ways we could be doing this? And I think we are going to have to, as a city, and this is, I'd love to hear any thoughts or comments you have, but also I don't expect you to solve the housing crisis right now. But I think there is something real to we are going to have to understand that even if everything is bigger in Texas, maybe it can't be infinitely so. And what does that mean for reimagining what even the suburbs could look like?
Exactly. And you were absolutely right that flooding is a bipartisan issue. Just from the conversations I've had with officials and also with residents, people across the political spectrum hate flooding. They don't want it's not a abstract discussion about climate and infrastructure. It's about their homes and their sense of safety. I just talked to a resident the other day, and he reached out to me and he called me and he said, I'm not a typical kind of person who would complain to you about the government. But, and I actually believe in private property, but the flooding that's happening caused by the new subdivision going up next to my property, that's endangering everyone, and that's just wrong. And in terms of how to fix it, you're right, I don't have a solution, but a lot of people I talk to seem to allude to just better flood mitigation and also stricter regulations when it comes to elevation, when it comes to detention ponds and the size of the ponds. There is a wide variety of regulations across the region, and some are just not as strict as others. But as you know, stormwater doesn't follow city or county lines. So if we have a lot of floodplain construction happening in Montgomery County without proper mitigation, which we do, that's going to affect Harris County as well.
Which is interesting because it is one of those things that really points us to this isn't something we can maybe fix just at a county level or just at the city level, but really does require, I think, working at a statewide level, but also, as you're pointing to, just like cooperation between these bodies. And we can think of things like the Galveston Area Council that, kind of represents a number of parties, but it does point to parties in the sense of different counties, right?
Right.
I'm thinking here very much about different places around the greater Houston area. But, I think these are places that we're going to have to look to thinking across and working together. And it is tricky because it does at times mean there are going to be interests who maybe aren't able to build exactly where they want to, but that's exactly going to protect the folks who built 2 years before. And also means we're going to have to shift what does building in these places look like? Is the most effective way going to be new 3,000 square foot homes that take up half an acre? Probably not. Like that just may be a relic of a bygone era because the city and the area has changed so much that to continue developing in that fashion is going to have real ramifications, not just for people downstream, but also the people moving into those flood-prone areas, which I think is a real, and I wanted to highlight a little bit because as you mentioned, Houston is a place that, we are just constantly taking in people from all over the country, internationally. There are so many new residents that are continuing to move into the area. You mentioned that like Harvey isn't a memory for some of them, that it's not something they're familiar with. And I think something that I really admire in a lot of the reporting you've been doing is that attention to, how to determine if you're at flood risk and then highlighting what is flood insurance and why does it matter? Because especially for folks who maybe haven't lived through a flood or haven't lived through a hurricane yet, for those of us who grew up on the Gulf South, we have all probably painfully learned the lesson at some point in life that flood insurance is separate from your homeowners and your homeowners will not cover that flood.
Right.
But I think, can you talk just a little bit, maybe for folks who haven't been here that long, who aren't originally from a flood-prone area, who don't really understand that? Because I think it is something continually worth reiterating because there is so much at risk if folks don't know what their flood risk is and aren't prepared for it.
Of course. So in Texas, sellers are actually required to disclose the property's flood risk. So that's good. But there are also major gaps in that protection. For one, if you're an investor and you're flipping a house and you only own the property for a short amount of time, you're only legally required to disclose what happened during that short amount of time. So it can be really hard for buyers to piece together the full flood history of a property they want to purchase. So they might think, they're moving here, they're having that suburban lifestyle, getting their dream home in a brand new subdivision, only to realize later when it's too late that there is significant risk that comes with that. And flood insurance is a completely different discussion. And, premiums have gone up in recent years. So it can cost thousands of dollars or even more if you live really close to a river or a lake a year to purchase that protection. So unless you're required to, some people choose not to because it's too expensive and they don't think they need it. So they really don't have a safety net when their house floods.
I think that's really important to highlight. It's something we've talked about. We've had, and listeners can go back into our archive and pull up kind of some of the post-Harvey conversations we had a couple of years ago for the 5th anniversary. And I mean, I think it's really worth revisiting that, folks are sometimes, especially pre-Harvey, we're advised not to have a flood insurance because they're like, oh, it's just a waste of money. This is where you are never floods, like you're fine. And then we do have a really significant disaster. And yeah, your homeowners won't cover that flooding. Mm-hmm. And realizing that and trying to navigate that and suddenly realizing I have $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 worth of damage that's just flooding that's not covered. I mean, that is bankruptcy for a lot of people. That can be losing your home. I think the other piece that you alluded to, though, and I think that's really important to highlight, is the more we do build in these highly flood-prone areas, folks look at already high mortgages, already high interest rates, and maybe aren't factoring in what certainly homeowners insurance, I think most people know, just keeps getting higher and higher too, because we're worried about hurricanes and other kind of disasters that might happen. But flood insurance is another major expense. And, I think it's really important, especially for folks who are coming here who don't have this kind of familiarity, to understand this is an expense you have to wrap up into your house. You want to be prepared for this because if you're not paying for it, if you're flooded, the consequences can just be devastating.
Right. As much as we suffer from chronic flooding, a lot of people don't prioritize flood risk when they choose their new home. They want things like, nice amenities, good school districts, a lot of space, which is all important, right? But some people don't really think about the flood risk.
If they want to learn more, especially for maybe the prospective buyers who are this is airing at a time where we're a little out of the season for house buying, but maybe folks will hold on to it for down the road. And there's, I'm sure, a couple of people out there who are looking. For prospective buyers and for just people who are genuinely concerned for themselves, which I think is a lot of us in Houston, are there any resources you would recommend to better understand flood risk around the area?
Right, that's a tricky one because FEMA flood maps utilize outdated data and are also very hard to navigate for people who are not familiar. First Street have a better data set with more information, so you can always search up your address on their data set and see what comes up. And also just ask a lot of questions. Talk to the neighbors in the neighborhood that you want to move into. See if they flooded during Harvey or if they flooded during the storm last year. Ask your developers or your real estate agent about what kind of mitigations they've done for the neighborhood, how big their detention pond is, and just really look into the property. Sometimes it's really just about going there and asking the right questions.
That's great. I will just one more time highlight the Chronicle's useful little database. Put in your address and go to it. Partially because even it has, I think, one of those questions that so many of us is our kind of barometer of flood risk. It tells you right there, this property flooded or didn't flood in Harvey.
Right.
And so I think at least for a starting place, that's also a really great resource. But all of those, First Street in particular, has really detailed prediction and uses different models from FEMA. So you're seeing different info that, FEMA gives you kind of one group of data sets that can be really useful, although, as you mentioned, it is really counterintuitive. It is not the easiest to navigate. I learned that firsthand trying to use some of that data last year when I was looking at houses. So it is a useful resource, but it can be tricky. First Street, which now also partners with a number of the like Zillow and Redfin and other kind of house searching websites that, too many of us whittle away our lives on. And so that info can be found a little more accessibly.
Right. Sadly, there isn't one place you can go to find out all the information about your property, but you just have to rely on all these different resources and try to piece together what a full flood history is.
So we're coming to the end of the time here, but I just want to give you the opportunity. I mean, you've done so much great reporting on this. You've really been digging in, thinking about these risks. What are the big takeaways that you're hoping folks who read your coverage in the Chronicle or who are listening to this are understanding about what this maybe means for the city going forward and how we should be thinking about flood risk and development as we start approaching the 10-year anniversary of Harvey not that long from now?
Sure. One more point I really want to highlight is climate change. That's also a takeaway for me and kind of the role that climate change plays in this whole picture. we are not taking it as seriously and really grappling with what it actually means for our region. So experts told me that unless we do something differently, both the disruption and the displacement are only going to get worse. But at the same time, some people have warned that we shouldn't use climate change as an excuse for bad development decisions. It's not that because, yes, the storms are getting worse, but it's not that we're going to flood no matter what we do. We can't just throw up our hands and say, we're doomed anyways, so let's just keep building on floodplains. There are still smarter, more responsible decisions we can make to mitigate the impact for the region.
I think that's a great place to mention the fact that I think 2, maybe 3 days after your article came out on the Chronicle, Rebecca Ward's piece was on the front page of the paper copy of Houston of the Chronicle with Houston is ground zero for climate change.
Right.
And so, I think those two are absolutely in conversation. I think it's a great place to mention that there is no escaping that we are in a changing environment, and we have to, try to stay ahead of that as much as we possibly can. And actually, I will break momentarily just to also note, we have seen in response to the tragic floods that happened in central Texas over the summer, the state house has actually moved a number of initiatives forward to try to improve resiliency and especially to prevent development, often pretty narrowly around things like summer camps. But there have been real steps taken to try to mitigate and to learn from that disaster. I would hope that we are able to push things forward in a way that we don't always have to just be reacting to loss of life and disaster, which is a really tragic and difficult way to learn these lessons. But I also hope that in moments where we recognize the need for change, that we can seize that moment and try to make some of these steps forward that you're suggesting, that we are getting ahead and mitigating in advance.
I hope so too.
That's hopefully a good place to wrap this up. Thank you so much for joining us. Your coverage can be read in the Houston Chronicle online or in print, although there's a number of really great maps and data sets online that I will try to steer folks to because I think they're really worth looking through and getting a better idea of what's going on in development around the greater Houston area. Yilun Cheng, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Next up, our researcher Nomin has a piece for us all about parks in unexpected places and what they can tell us about how we can not only redevelop but grow beauty out of things that often seem like they would offer none.
I spent a part of my childhood in Virginia. Every time my family visited the beach in Virginia Beach, we would always make sure to visit the city's central park, Mount Trashmore. The park is a hilltop park, with kids always flying kites and families lounging on the grassy mound, with a playground, skate park, and encircling path in the distance. However, as the name suggests, beneath the grass covering the hill lies 640,000 tons of compacted garbage, layered with clean soil and grass. In the late 60s, this landfill was transformed into the first official landfill park in the United States, and its main mountain rises to 60 feet and 800 feet in length. When you visit the park and immerse yourself in the surroundings, like Lake Windsor below, it's hard to believe that the park was once a dump site for trash. However, turning dumps into playgrounds isn't entirely new. A century ago, Seattle capped its Rainier dump and in 1916 opened the Rainier Playfield, one of the earliest documented landfill parks. During the Great Depression, the city also reclaimed the Miller Street dump, which later became part of the Washington Park Arboretum. In New York, its famous Corona dumps, which were once immortalized as the Valley of Ashes in The Great Gatsby, were filled and landscaped to host the 1939 World's Fair. These early conversions were modest compared with today's megaprojects, but they proved even in the early 20th century that landfills could be repurposed into recreational spaces. In the late 20th century, stricter environmental rules shaped the practices. In 1991, the Environmental Protection Agency mandated that municipal landfills install clay and plastic liners, vegetative caps, and gas venting systems and be monitored for at least 30 years after closure. Those regulations made it safer to build parks atop the capped landfills, but they also increased the costs for these conversion projects, meaning that converting a landfill to park could now cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per acre. Still, the idea of the landfill park gained momentum as closed landfills are usually tracts of large land within or near urban centers, and there are few other uses that don't require heavy excavation. Closed landfills present heavy challenges. They often sit idle, still emitting methane and possibly contaminating groundwater. Capping them and planting vegetation help control leachate and stabilize soil, and converting them into parks adds value for the public through recreation space, habitat restoration, and sometimes even revenue from landfill gas. For example, Portland's St. John's landfill pipes methane 2 miles to heat a cement kiln, generating more than $100,000 a year to fund closure operations. The city of Virginia Beach also credits Mount Trashmore with drawing over 1 million visitors annually. In Los Angeles, a gas-to-energy plant at the Puente Hills landfill powers roughly 70,000 homes. So, what makes a landfill safe for recreation? Engineers install multiple layers of protection. At Fresh Kills Park on Staten Island, which was once the world's largest landfill, each hill is capped with 8 layers, including an impermeable plastic liner, drainage materials, and 2 feet of clean soil. Methane vents, leachate collection pipes, and monitoring wells prevent gas buildup and heavy groundwater contamination. Because waste continues to settle for decades, planners avoid heavy structures and design trails, meadows, and lightweight facilities instead. The origin of the U.S. landfill park begins in Virginia Beach. In the late 1960s, the city of Virginia Beach piled municipal waste and cover soil until a 60-foot-high mound rose above the flat landscape of the coast. The site became Mount Trashmore Park in 1974. Today, the 165-acre park features 2 hills, Mount Trashmore and the smaller Encore Hill, 2 lakes, Lake Windsor and Lake Trashmore, and amenities like a xeriscaped garden, playgrounds, a skate park, and multi-use paths. It stands as a case study in turning a liability into a cherished community asset and remains a tourist attraction in its own right today. In the 1990s, Boston's Gardner Street landfill was reclaimed using soil from the city's Big Dig Highway project. The result is Millennium Park, a 100-acre green space in the West Roxbury neighborhood. Work began in 1994, and the park officially opened in December 2000. Millennium Park includes 25 acres of sports fields, playgrounds, an outdoor classroom, an amphitheater, a canoe launch on the Charles River, and even conservation land. Paths wind through the restored wetlands, making it hard to imagine that the site was once a place that held municipal waste. Fresh Kills Parks is perhaps the most ambitious landfill conversion in the United States. The Fresh Kills landfill operated from 1948 until 2001, and at its peak received up to 29,000 tons of waste per day. When it closed, it contained roughly 150 million tons of garbage. New York City decided to transform the 2,200-acre site, nearly 3 times the size of Central Park, into a regional park. Construction is unfolding in phases through 2036. The first major section, Phase 1, opened in October 2023. This 21-acre area includes walking paths and a separate high-speed bicycle path, a photovoltaic shade structure powering an off-grid comfort station with composting toilets, a bird observation tower, and wetlands overlook decks. Future phases will add playgrounds, athletic fields, kayak launches, horseback riding trails, and further art installations. Beneath the rolling hills, methane collection and leachate treatment continue to operate, and the site now supports more than 200 species of wildlife. As mentioned earlier, the Puente Hills landfill east of Los Angeles actually closed in 2013 after 56 years of operation. By then, it had accumulated about 150 million tons of waste and rose to nearly 500 feet high. The county's master plan, approved in 2016, proposes converting 142 acres into the first regional park built in the county in 30 years. Early designs call for hiking and mountain biking trails, a dog park, picnic areas, overlooks, and a wildlife habitat. To reduce greenhouse gases, planners hope visitors will use a gondola and shuttles instead of driving. In June 2024, officials announced a $200 million project budget, with $80 million funded by the Sanitation District and a $12.5 million grant from the Wildlife Conservation Board. This first phase will include an environmental justice center with community rooms, a small auditorium, and exhibits about the landfill's history. And it will also restore 40 acres to native grasslands and oak habitat. The county aims to open this phase around 2026 to 2027. In Portland, the city's diverse Cully neighborhood lacked a central park until the city partnered with a nonprofit Verde to convert the Killingsworth Fast Disposal Landfill. The 24-acre landfill closed in 1990, and Portland acquired the property in 2002, finalizing a master plan in 2009 and opening Cully Park in June 2018 at a cost of $12 million. The project won an Oregon Brownfield Redevelopment Award, and today visitors enjoy accessible picnic and play areas, community gardens, a dog park, walking loops, and a restored prairie. The partnership prioritized local hiring and involved community members in design, illustrating further how landfill parks can support equity and environmental justice. However, not all landfill parks are large. In the 1960s, the town of Zebulon converted a small neighborhood dump into Gill Street Park for the historically black Gill Street community. The micro park covers about 1 acre, and much of the remaining land is flood-prone. Recent soil tests revealed elevated lead levels in some areas, prompting closures and immediate remediation efforts. The town is working with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality to clean the site and install new playground equipment. Gill Street Park's story highlights the importance of continued monitoring and investment in small, often overlooked communities. More locally in Austin, a 1950s landfill was converted into Mabel Davis Park in 1979, but the park had to close in 2000 due to erosion and contamination from illegally dumped fertilizer and battery casings. After an $8.5 million remediation to meet EPA standards, the park reopened in 2005. Today, it features trails, sport courts, and a skate park. Mabel Davis Park serves as another cautionary tale about the importance of proper capping, gas control, and monitoring, especially for older landfills that predate modern regulations. Despite their appeal, landfill parks also face significant challenges. The first challenge is settlement. As buried waste decomposes, the ground sinks. Designers must account for differential settlement and avoid heavy structures. Trails and fields can be re-rated more easily than buildings, for instance. Secondly, methane gas, produced by decomposing organic waste, can migrate through soil and accumulate in enclosed spaces. U.S. regulations require that methane concentrations stay below 25% of the lower explosive limit within structures and below the explosive limit at property boundaries. Gas collection systems, vents, and flares, like those at fresh kills, are essential. Leachate must also be captured and treated to prevent groundwater pollution. The third major disadvantage is the cost. The Council for Environmentally Balanced Projects estimates that landfill to park conversions can cost around $300,000 per acre, although small projects may cost $500,000 for just 2 acres, and large projects can exceed over $30 million. Brookfield Park's $256 million price tag shows how quickly costs can climb. Financing often combines municipal funds, state grants, private donations, and occasionally revenue from methane or renewable energy. Another challenge to consider is securing environmental justice. Many landfills were located in marginalized communities. Puente Hills planners, for example, explicitly aim to create an environmental justice center and provide transit access so that nearby residents can benefit. Gill Street Park's ongoing remediation underscores that small parks and historically black neighborhoods deserve the same care as other flagship projects. Lastly, the final challenge is long-term maintenance. Monitoring for settlement, gas emissions, and contamination must continue for decades. Mabel Davis Park's temporary closure shows what happens when oversight lapses. Over the past century, communities have turned thousands of acres of buried trash into places where people play, picnic, and connect with nature. From the pioneering Rainier Playground to the massive Fresh Kills project, landfill parks demonstrate how careful engineering, regulatory oversight, and community vision can convert environmental liabilities into assets for the community. Yet the work is not simple. High costs, ongoing maintenance, and the legacy of environmental justice require long-term, honest commitment. As more landfills reach capacity and close, the question isn't whether we can build parks on garbage, since we can, but how to do so equitably, sustainably, and creatively. So if you ever find yourself on a grassy hill, ask yourself, what's beneath my feet?
Finally, we'll be turning to our researcher, Sophia Soltes, who has the latest in her series of Critter Corner pieces, all about animals around town.
Hi, everyone. It's Sophia, and welcome back to Critter Corner, where we dive into Houston's fascinating wildlife. In each episode, we will feature experts and enthusiasts who share their favorite local flora and fauna, the role in our ecosystem, and finally, ways that we can all support our community's biodiversity. In this episode, we're joined by Alicia Bai, who is a long-term Houston native and now the veterinarian for West Sound Wildlife Shelter on Bainbridge Island, Washington. Welcome to the show, Alicia.
Thanks, Sophia.
Of course. So, to start off, can you tell me a bit about yourself and the work that you do?
I'm a veterinarian. I work on wildlife now. I used to have a small animal practice in Houston. When we moved up to Washington State, I started doing wildlife, and I've been doing it for 13 years now. So, West Sound Wildlife Shelter on Bainbridge Island is where I work now. But again, spent the majority of my life in Houston.
Well, thank you for coming on. We're excited to talk to you. Uh,
Sure.
what species will you be talking about today, and why is it special to you?
We're going to talk about the Virginia opossum because it is a much misunderstood species that people don't know much about. And it's definitely a Houston native. And I think that it's an animal that most people have come in contact with at some point in their lives, but usually don't know what to do. Opossums are exceedingly harmless and do a lot of good for the environment. So I think it's an interesting topic just from a what do you do? What kind of animal are you standpoint?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And you said it yourself, this animal is very misunderstood. So I'm ready to dive into some more questions just about what it is, why it's important, and to help people understand more about this amazing animal. So,
Sure.
on that note, what role does the opossum play in the ecosystem?
So in the ecosystem in Houston, a lot of what it does is it cleans up insects. They eat ticks, they eat slugs, they eat all sorts of bugs that you don't want around your house. And they also eat just trash, dead bird, trash on the side of the road. I mean, they're cleanup animals. And again, the thing that I think is very interesting about them that actually helps people is they eat ticks. And that's a health concern for people and for pets in Houston. So, having this little genie that wanders around and collects ticks out of your yard is interesting. They're also very unassuming creatures. They're not going to attack you or do anything mean. They have a mouthful of teeth, but they seldom bite. They're just interesting animals.
Yeah, and to further that last aspect that you mentioned, that they're interesting animals, what's one surprising fact about this species that people might not know, or multiple if you're really feeling it?
Well, I think the most interesting thing about them is that they're a marsupial, which means they're basically closer to a kangaroo than to a dog or a cat. They have a pouch, which marsupial is a pouched mammal. And they're the only marsupial in North America. So they're the only animal that has babies in their pouch and raises them in their pouch in North America. And so that to me is something that's pretty strange and pretty special and very exclusive. I mean, did you even know it was a marsupial? Well, I know you did, but most people don't. Yeah, so another fun fact is that when they're born, they're basically the size of bumblebees and they crawl down into their mother's pouch when they are the size of a bumblebee. And they stay there until they're, about, I'm trying to think of how to describe, the size of a small kitten or so. Um, and that's when they emerge from the pouch, and that's when they kind of start to wander off from mom and do some of their own things. So, that's again though this metamorphosis from bumblebee to kitten size, all in a pouch in the United States of America. It's kind of interesting.
And are the babies pretty independent after they climb out of the pouch, or do they stay around
Yes.
the mother for a long time?
They stay around the mother for a little bit. Sometimes they ride on her back. Sometimes they'll stay in and out of the pouch. But after they're out of the pouch, they're usually pretty much on their own within a few weeks.
And I'm curious, do you have a favorite personal story or experience with the Virginia opossum?
Well, at the shelter, we actually use them sometimes. We train them for being educational ambassadors. Like we take them to schools and take them to fairs and to the state fair and things like that. And it takes a while to train them. They have to be unreleasable for some other reason. We don't just keep one that would be fine out in the wild. But after they're trained, they make wonderful education animals and are really good about going into the classroom and then having this message delivered where it's like, they won't hurt you. They eat bugs, they're, just kind of those main tenets, that they're good animals and they share a lot that people need, and to just let them be, basically. But the education part of it is interesting. It's been interesting to train them.
So I know you've had a lot of experience working with opossums in the wildlife shelter. So what's some little piece of advice that you would share with our listeners today based on that firsthand experience on what you see?
From a rescue standpoint, I think the important thing to know is that usually they don't need to be rescued. Usually they just need to be left alone. If you find a baby, unless it's distressed in some way or is very, very small, it's usually probably within reach of its mom somewhere. If you find an adult and if it kicks back and does its freeze pose and, playing possum, just leave it alone, walk away from it. Don't do anything to it. It's not going to do anything to you. It's, that's their go-to, is just freezing and stopping and laying back on their back and showing their teeth. And again, they have a lot of teeth, but they don't bite. So leave them alone. But that's also advice for most wildlife, is leave them alone.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I think it's so important, especially because, it's pretty common for people to see a little cute animal laying by the side of the road or a baby without its mom and just assume that it needs help, but it doesn't always. And that's important to remember. And on a bigger scale, what are some simple ways that people can support the Virginia opossum beyond leaving it alone?
Really, they support themselves, which is one of the beautiful things about it. You don't need to put out feeders for them or, give them extra stuff, because they find what they need on their own. It's a very simple, kind of symbiotic relationship if you just let them be and let them eat the bugs, let them eat the slugs in your yard, let them slide along and do their thing, because they're not going to do anything to hurt you, and they don't eat vegetation. There's nothing that they're going to do that's going to cause a problem for you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Alicia. It's been great to chat with you about the Virginia opossum. And to everyone listening, thank you so much for tuning in, and make sure to come back soon to learn more about these fascinating local species.
That's our show for this week. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081. That's 713-348-4081. Or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Nomin Rinson-George and Sophia Soltesz. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French, here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.